Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going back in time to the Gilded Age,
Oh, yeah.
a time of huge societal change and crazy wealth.
Yeah. A lot of extravagance back then.
And as we're going to see today, some pretty big secrets, too.
Some scandal.
So get ready to dive into a case that shocked New York City and the whole nation.
The whole country.
Yeah, a story of love and betrayal and a mysterious death that's still unsolved to this day.
It really is a fascinating case. Really captures the feeling of the times, I think. All that glamour, but also, the tensions bubbling under the surface.
Yeah.
And of course, forensics wasn't what it is today.
Right. Makes you wonder how they ever solved anything back then.
Yeah.
Well, you shared this fascinating audio excerpt with me from a true crime podcast
Yeah.
about this case. And I got to say, I'm really eager to hear what you think about it.
Definitely. Happy to share my thoughts.
So let's set the stage. It's 1904.
Yeah.
And our story focuses on two people. Nan Patterson,
Okay.
a young woman trying to become famous
Yeah.
on the Broadway stage. And Caesar Young, a self-made millionaire with a love for risk and apparently romance.
A bit of a ladies' man.
Yeah, it seems that way.
This case, what makes it so interesting is that it throws us right into the middle of a changing society. Women were starting to push for more independence,
Yeah.
but at the same time, traditional values, those still had a strong hold on things, especially how people saw women in the public eye.
Right, right. And that's where Nan Patterson fits in, I guess.
Exactly.
The podcast describes her as a real beauty.
Yeah, a captivating beauty.
Yeah. And a former chorus girl with the famous Florodora girls.
Oh, the Florodora girl.
You know anything about them?
Well, known for their strict standards. And,
A little bit of a scandal themselves.
they did have a reputation.
Yeah. It sounds like it.
These women, they were expected to embody like the ultimate feminine beauty, tall and slender, captivating on stage.
Oh, wow.
But they also faced a ton of pressure from society. People judged them harshly for wanting to be independent and successful.
So they were adored, but also under a microscope.
Exactly. It was a difficult position to be in.
Yeah, I can imagine. So tell me more about Nan's background. Where does she fit into all this glamour and tragedy?
Well, Nan, her real name was Elizabeth Patterson, born in 1882.
Okay.
By the time she was in her late teens, she was already married, separated,
Oh, wow.
and determined to make it in the theater world. That's when she meets Caesar Young, the man who would change her life forever.
Caesar Young, the self-made millionaire.
Oh,
The podcast makes him sound like quite a character.
he was. A former athlete, successful horse trader, a bit of a gambler,
Oh, wow.
and as we'll find out, living a double life.
It sounds like it.
It's almost a classic rags to riches story.
Eh.
He immigrated to the U.S., poor young man, excelled in athletics, then made his fortune in horse racing.
Wow.
He was known for being charismatic and living a lavish lifestyle, but under the surface, things were complicated.
Complicated is an understatement. He was devoted to his wife,
Ah.
Margaret, back in New York, but at the same time having this passionate
Yeah.
and very public affair with Nan.
Yeah, it's the classic love triangle, right?
Yeah.
But with the added weight of society's expectations
Yeah.
and all that public scrutiny, remember back then, divorce was a big no-no.
Yeah.
Adultery, that was seen as like a serious moral failing.
So you have this glamorous actress
Mm-hmm.
and this wealthy married businessman in a forbidden romance.
Yeah.
It's not surprising that this affair caused a lot of gossip, even led to a dramatic confrontation with Caesar's wife at a bathhouse in Los Angeles.
Oh, it was a huge scandal. And even though they tried to end things, their connection, it seems like it was just too strong. Maybe even stronger because it was forbidden.
It sounds like a powder keg just waiting to blow up.
Right.
And blow up it did. On a morning in June 1904.
This is where the story takes a dark turn. Caesar was supposed to leave for a trip to Europe with his wife to try and fix their marriage. But the night before he leaves, he insists on meeting Nan one last time.
Wow, imagine the tension. The podcast mentions his brother-in-law actually chaperoned this farewell dinner.
Oh, yeah. Awkward.
I can't even imagine how uncomfortable that must have been.
It really says something about the times, you know? They were trying to control this situation, but it was already way out of control.
So they argue. Caesar says it's over. He's committed to his wife. But then what does he do? He lies to his wife the next morning, says he has urgent business before meeting her at the pier for their trip.
And that urgent business, of course, was meeting Nan one last time.
One last time. Before heading to that same pier to go on a romantic getaway with his wife.
It does sound like a recipe for disaster.
It does. They get into this fancy cab, headed for the pier, And then a gunshot rings out, and everything changes.
And the cab driver, he hears the shot, stops the carriage, and finds this awful scene. Caesar Young, dead, shot, slumped over in Nan's lap.
Wow.
It was a moment that would start one of the biggest trials of the century.
I bet. And right away, different stories start coming out, don't they?
They do.
Adding more layers to this already pretty complicated story. Nan, of course, first says that Caesar killed himself.
Right. Overcome by despair. And, you know, at first it kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
You have a man facing money problems. His marriage is falling apart. He feels guilty about this affair. Suicide, it could seem like, well, a tragic but understandable end.
Yeah, I can see that. But then, as the investigation goes on, things start to point in a different direction, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
The way he was shot, no suicide note. And people start whispering about possible reasons for murder. It all starts to make Nan's story seem less believable.
Exactly. And then you have the people who are involved, like Caesar's business partner. He comes in and makes these wild accusations.
Oh, yeah. What was that about?
Well, he says that Nan had driven other men to suicide before, though there was never any proof of that.
It's like something out of a book. The beautiful, manipulative woman. Using men and then discarding them.
Yeah, and that plays right into the fears people had back then about independent women like Nan.
Right. This idea of the femme fatale.
Exactly. The woman who uses her beauty to hurt men. And this idea, it becomes a big part of the 3 trials Nan would face for Caesar's death.
Let's talk about those trials. This is where the case really blows up. The first trial starts in November 1904, just a few months after the shooting. And right away, it's huge news.
It was a spectacle, reporters everywhere, trying to get every detail, every little twist and turn. The prosecution, they want to get a conviction. So they paint Nan as this jealous, vengeful woman, someone who murdered Caesar because she was afraid of losing him.
They claim he couldn't have shot himself, the gun wasn't his, and that Nan planned the whole thing. It sounds like their case really depends on what the pawnbroker who sold the gun says.
Yeah, they're trying to link Nan to the gun, but the pawnbroker, he can't actually say for sure who bought it.
So from the beginning, there's this uncertainty, like a missing piece of the puzzle they can't find. But the defense, they're telling a totally different story.
Right. They say it was suicide, driven by despair and too much drinking.
Makes sense.
They even bring in 2 witnesses who say they saw the shooting from the street, which would back up the suicide theory.
Interesting. But then there's this moment, this really dramatic moment, where the prosecution tries to use a skeleton, like a medical skeleton, in court.
Oh, yeah. To show how the bullet went through Caesar's body, they were trying to prove that it couldn't have been suicide because of the angle.
A skeleton in the courtroom. That's crazy.
It was. Even the reporters said it wasn't really helpful, just dramatic.
Wow. Even back then, they were using props to try and influence the jury. Makes you wonder how much of a role theatrics play in court, then and now. But anyway, that first trial, it ends suddenly. Not with a verdict, but with a mistrial.
Yeah, one of the jurors got sick, had a stroke during the trial, and they didn't have any alternate jurors, so the judge had to declare a mistrial.
Wow. That's a tough break for Nan and her lawyers.
It was. They were feeling pretty good about that jury.
Yeah, it sounds like they were close to getting her off. And then boom, everything starts over. So a few weeks later, they're back in court for the second trial. What's different this time? What do they each try to do?
The prosecution, they stick with their story, that Nan is a manipulative killer. The defense, though, they have a new problem. The media's gone crazy because of how the prosecution's portraying Nan, and her lawyer made a comment that got twisted by the press.
Wait, what happened? I remember something about the jury in the first trial.
Yeah, Nan's lawyer, he said something about being confident in the jury, like he thought they were fair. Well, the reporters took that and ran with it. They said Nan was trying to pick jurors who would side with her.
So they're using her being a woman against her again, taking something innocent and making it sound bad.
Exactly. And they even pointed out that the juror was all older men. Like they were suggesting these men were easy to charm by a pretty woman.
It just shows how the media can shape what people think. And maybe even affect the outcome of a trial. It's scary.
It is. It reminds you that being innocent until proven guilty doesn't always mean much when the public's already made up their mind.
Yeah, that's true. So Nan's facing her second trial with all this bad press surrounding her. Do any new facts or arguments come up this time?
The second trial was pretty similar to the first. Prosecution says it's murder, defense says it's suicide, but this time there is one big difference. Nan takes the stand. She testifies.
Wow, that's a big moment. The public finally gets to hear her side of the story directly from her. What does she say? How does she present herself?
Nan's testimony, it's interesting. She says she had nothing to do with Caesar's death. Insists she loved him and that they were going to stay together. She even says he was going to send for her after he got settled in Europe. So she's painting this picture of a future together. A future that got cut short.
So she's saying she wasn't a jealous lover, but a devoted partner.
Yeah.
Caught in a tragedy. But she also admits that they argued in the cab that morning.
All right. She does. She says Caesar got upset when she wasn't sure about leaving everything behind and going to Europe with him. And then she says he grabbed her. And that's when she heard the gunshot. And he just collapsed. It's a dramatic story. And it leaves the jury with more questions than answers.
It sounds like she's walking a tightrope, admitting that things were intense between them, but still saying she's innocent. But the jury wasn't convinced, were they? Did they find her guilty?
Not at all. They talked for 11 hours. And then said they were totally stuck. They couldn't agree. 10 of them wanted to say she was not guilty, and 2 wanted to say she was guilty.
Oh, wow.
The judge told them to try again. But just an hour later, they came back even more divided. 6 for guilty, 6 for not guilty. A complete deadlock. So, another mistrial.
A second mistrial. You're kidding.
I know, right? It shows you how powerful the idea of reasonable doubt is, and just how complicated this case was. Even after hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury just couldn't decide if Nan was guilty or not.
And that uncertainty, that inability to come to a clear conclusion, it would just keep hanging over the case. Even as the prosecution pushed for a third trial. So now it's like do or die time. Right. 2 trials, 2 hung juries. You'd think they'd just let it go. Admit they don't have enough to convict her.
Yeah, you'd think so. But they didn't, I guess, with all the media attention and the public pressure. They just had to try again. So they went for a third trial.
A third trial. Wow, that's got to be rare. What were they thinking? Did they find something new?
Not really. It seems like this time they were focused on the jury. They wanted a jury made up entirely of married men.
Really?
Yeah, they figured those guys would be less likely to fall for Nan's charms and maybe even see her as a threat to marriage itself.
It's amazing how much gender roles and what society expected back then played into this whole thing. It makes you wonder if a man would have been treated the same way.
Yeah, it's a good point. Remember, this was a time when women's roles were changing fast, and a lot of people were nervous about it. Nan, with her beauty and independence and her ambition, she probably represented those fears for a lot of people.
It's like she became a symbol of all that anxiety about society changing.
Yeah, I think so.
And through it all, she kept saying she was innocent, that she didn't kill Caesar. But in this third trial, did anything change? Was there any new evidence or testimony that might have swayed the jury?
There was one big thing, a piece of evidence that, looking back, should have made a huge difference. It had to do with gunshot residue.
Oh, okay. Gunshot residue. Even back then, that could have given some real answers.
Right. So here's the thing. Nan's hands were clean, but they found gunshot residue on Caesar's fingers.
So that means he was the one holding the gun.
Yeah, which backs up what Nan's been saying all along, that Caesar shot himself. Seems like pretty important evidence, right?
It does. But the prosecution, they wouldn't budge. They kept pushing that pawnbroker's testimony, trying to link Nan to buying the gun.
Right. But like we said, the pawnbroker's memory was fuzzy. He couldn't say for sure who bought it.
So even with this new evidence, they couldn't make their case. What happened with the third trial? Did the jury finally make a decision?
Well, they talked it over for a long time. And guess what? Another hung jury. They just couldn't agree. Some thought she was guilty, some didn't. And for the third time, they couldn't come to a unanimous decision.
3 trials, 3 hung juries. At that point, the prosecution had to give up, right?
They did. They figured a forced trial wouldn't get them anywhere. So on May 12, 1905, after more than a year in jail, Nan Patterson was set free.
Wow, finally free. But I bet it took a toll on her all that time in jail, with everyone thinking she was a murderer.
It's hard to imagine what she went through, even though she was never convicted. I'm sure that suspicion followed her for a long time.
It just shows you, sometimes getting justice isn't so simple. And what the public thinks can be more powerful than what happens in court.
Yeah, that's true. The Nan Patterson case, it really sticks with you. It gives us more questions than answers. Did Caesar Young kill himself? Was it an accident? Or did Nan actually plan his murder, like the prosecution said?
We might never know for sure. The evidence is messy. The stories don't line up. But we can look at the details, think about the time period, and see how societal biases affected how people saw this case and what happened to Nan.
And it also makes you appreciate how far we've come with forensics and how much better we understand the legal system now compared to back then.
It's a case that makes you think critically, question everything, and realize that even when it seems like there's a ton of evidence, the truth can be really hard to find. So what do you think happened that day in that cab? We'd love to hear your theories. Let us know in the comments. And thanks for joining us for another deep dive.